I don't like paying taxes more than the next guy. I mean, I know taxes are used for things like roads and schools, which are good, but it always just kind of feels counterproductive, right? If your job is to produce things and make money, then you get taxed for doing so. It's like a disincentive for being successful, and I just don't like that idea. Now, as I dove into this topic, I found that there might be a better way to do this, to actually increase the government's bottom line and reduce or significantly reduce the taxes that we pay as citizens. And this also could lead to us reducing the amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. Yes, today we're talking about carbon taxes, what they are, how they help, and most importantly, do they work? But to understand the nature of this idea, we need to explain a few key terms that a lot of climate deniers love to dismiss. The first one is negative externalities. Now, this idea is a pretty simple one, despite the term being pretty nerdy, and you might see lots of graphs and different ways that people try to explain this with math. But here's the deal. When a company makes something and sells it, they have a cost associated with it. The difference between how much they sell it for and how much it costs to produce is their profit. And that profit needs to cover all the other expenses, right? The things that don't go directly into the cost of making the thing. Now, if you're selling apples you grow on your farm, it's a pretty simple calculation, right? But what if during the process of making your product, say extracting oil from the deep sea, you end up polluting the waters nearby, killing off all the fish, and now the local fishing industry suffers? That is a negative externality. Essentially, by extracting oil, you producing your product from the deep sea, you caused harm to others who then lost income, and you yourself never had to pay for those costs. That's the basic idea of a negative externality. And of course, we all remember Deepwater Horizon back in 2010, where this oil rig out in the Gulf of Mexico exploded, killing 11 crew members and releasing almost 5 million barrels of oil into the ocean across 87 days. There were just countless photos of the ocean just filled with oil slicks and just things coagulating and creating all kinds of toxic stuff on beaches and just really devastating the entire Gulf there. I mean, they had to do these burns where they literally would burn the oil that was floating on top of the ocean to try to get rid of it, creating these massive clouds of black smoke all over the southern part of the United States and eastern part of Mexico. Now, the damage to the Gulf of Mexico is hard to overstate. I mean, it disrupted entire ecosystems and hurt millions of people that live in the surrounding coastal communities. In this case, BP did end up paying out $65 billion for the mistake, but in a lot of cases, these incidents go without any penalties at all. And this is where we meet our economic hero of the story, Arthur Cecil Pigou. Now, in research for this video, I came across some really confusing headlines, and that's where today's sponsor, Ground News, came to the rescue. Now, even prior to making this video and partnering with Ground News, I've been actually paying for this service myself, and I still use it daily to keep on top of what's going on out there without being overwhelmed by all the spin that so many news outlets put on their stories. When researching this video, I wanted to see what was really going on with carbon taxes, and that's where I discovered that even as recent as last week, some major shifts were happening to the north in Canada with their version of carbon taxes. And the crux of this news story that I found is that the new Prime Minister in Canada has already acted to eliminate part of their carbon tax at the federal level. And within the story, I was able to see that there were a total of 63 news sources, 21 of which were leaning left, 9 right, and 5 center, with the bias distribution of 60% left. And they have this handy little chart here where you can actually see and just click on the individual stories if you wanted to. You see, what Ground News is, it takes into account the political leanings of each publication when aggregating these different stories. They also rank the outlets based on their factuality and list who they're owned by or if they're independent. So that way, it gives you a better context surrounding the news that you're consuming. So join me and millions of people using Ground News each day by signing up at ground.news/Sullins or by scanning the QR code on the screen right now. You'll not only take back loads of your own time, but you'll also get an additional 40% off unlimited access to worldwide coverage through my link today. Thanks, Ground News, for sponsoring this video. Now let's dive into really what's going on with carbon taxes. Arthur C. Pigou was a British economist renowned for his work in welfare economics. In his seminal book, The Economics of Welfare, published in 1920, Pigou expanded on Alfred Marshall's concept of externalities, which we've already talked about a little bit, but to add to the negative externalities we discussed, there's also this idea of positive externalities in which the cost of making a thing creates some ROI, some benefit to society that the maker doesn't realize. This is what happens, for example, when electric cars reduce air pollution, which in turn reduce costs to the public healthcare system. Yet the people that made those cars never recoup any of that benefit. So in this case, Pigou and other economists would argue for the government to subsidize those efforts to correct what they call market inefficiencies or market failures, where the actual cost of a thing isn't realized entirely within the same transaction. And this is a concept among economists now known as a Pigouvian tax. And it sort of makes sense, right? For example, if you want companies and people to work and earn income, and then you tax them on that income, as I mentioned, it creates this friction, right? Essentially, the more money you make, you get taxed more. So at some point, it's sort of a diminishing return, right? Once you reach a certain threshold, there's kind of no point or no more incentive to keep pushing and keep producing more and innovating. Then, on the other hand, you have companies that pollute the environment, hurting communities and businesses alike. However, they never have to pay for the damage that they're causing. So if you have a tax on those things that they're producing, it will incentivize them to stop polluting, leading to a benefit to the broader community and society. And probably the most common example of this is a tax on cigarettes. We like freedom in the Western world, at least for now, maybe. And that means that banning things usually doesn't work. We really hate when we're just prohibited from something. Take a look at what happened in the United States during our prohibition of alcohol, as an example. But the thing about smoking is that it causes health issues for people that don't smoke themselves. So to put a finer point on that, a study done in the US by the National Institute of Health shows that in 3 different survey periods, 2000, 2005, and 2010, that secondhand smoke exposure at home was associated with increased hospital nights and emergency room visits among non-smoking adults. So the annual healthcare costs attributable to this exposure were estimated at $4.6 billion in 2000, $2.1 billion in 2005, and $1.9 billion in 2010 after adjusting for inflation. So it's going down, right? And across those same 10 years, you probably guessed, taxes on cigarettes went up dramatically. And this is a real-life version of the Pigouvian style tax here that did, in fact, reduce the cost associated with these negative externalities. So it works when we try to do it correctly. But to understand how this might work for carbon, I wanted to see if anyone else had done this before or if it was just sort of an idea that economists came up with. That's when I found out that in Canada, they've had a carbon tax since 2007. And since I, like most Americans, don't really know a whole lot about what's going on up in Canada, I decided to call up Professor Chris Reagan at the Max Bell School of Public Policy at McGill University in Montreal, Canada, and ask him how it works up there with the carbon tax.
Well, look, the basic idea is very simple. You start with a recognition that carbon emissions are a problem, okay? And the goal is to reduce carbon emissions, okay? That's the starting point. And so then the question is, what is a carbon price and how would it do it? Well, a carbon price, the easiest way to think of a carbon price is think of it as a tax. It doesn't actually have to be a tax, but think of it as a tax on everything that emits carbon. So you put a tax on a gallon of gasoline. You put a tax on a cubic foot of natural gas. You put a tax on a ton of coal, right? Because those things, when you burn them, they generate greenhouse gas emissions or carbon emissions. So you put a tax on those things that increases the price of those things, and that produces a pretty powerful economic incentive to kind of move away from using those things. So over time, people, change from big cars to small cars, or they change from small cars or big cars to hybrids or to electric vehicles, or they switch out a natural gas furnace to an electric furnace. Or it changes the way they take their vacations. Or on the production side, it changes the way we produce our steel or the technology we use to produce fertilizer. because this is the idea of a carbon price or a carbon tax can apply to households and families. It can apply to small businesses, and it can apply to large businesses or heavy industry. And it's really all about, it's not about raising revenue. That's actually not the goal, and I'll come back to that. It's really about changing prices in a way that will drive a behavioral change. And in particular, all of us will kind of, live our lives in ways over time that reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
But wait, if we tax people for their carbon emissions, then they will emit less carbon and will be out of that tax revenue, right? So this will sort of work its way out of a job and then cause more economic problems down the road. Again, here's Professor Reagan on that.
In Canada, the way we designed this carbon price was that it wasn't about revenue generation, okay? Because it was financing rebates that were going back. I said 90% of that consumer-facing carbon price was used to finance rebates back to individuals. The other 10% was given back to municipalities, universities, schools, and hospitals. So all of the money was going out the door, right? Back to people or back to entities. So it was never about revenue generation. So when the revenue generation disappeared, let's suppose we fast forward 50 years and there's basically no more emissions to price. So there's no more revenue to generate, but that means there's also no more need for the rebates. So the whole thing just sort of, what's the Western expression? It sort of evaporates in the distance or rides off into the horizon or whatever the expression is. Now, if you are using the revenue to finance other tax cuts, and some jurisdictions do this, which is perfectly reasonable, then as the revenue changes over time, then, it's financing less tax cuts. So you have to think about that. But this is why I quite like the way that the federal government in Canada designed this policy, because it's not sort of interfering in positively or negatively with the government's overall budget. It's more or less budget neutral, which means then that issue just isn't an issue in the future, right? As revenues change, the rebates change, and then the whole thing just sort of, 50 years down the road, the whole thing just sort of ends.
So I thought that was a pretty innovative way that they've structured it. So you get the money back, right? So you have to pay the tax now, and then you get it back on your taxes later. So at the end, it really doesn't cost you anything extra. And that way also, when you do start emitting less and there's no more tax in revenue to come in to do the rebates, then it's just, you're not being taxed on it either. So it's kind of the net effect is zero across the board. So I think that's pretty innovative. And it appears to have worked so far. I looked at a 5-year review in British Columbia, which was one of the first provinces that actually put on a carbon tax. And they showed a reduction in fossil fuel use by about 19% on a per capita basis. That's a pretty big deal considering how many people there are in BC. And this is basically directly attributable to this carbon tax. Now, in addition to Canada, Sweden has actually had a carbon tax all the way back since 1991. And during that time, they've reduced greenhouse gases by nearly 30% while maintaining solid GDP growth. In addition to the revenues from the carbon tax, they were able to lower taxes on its citizens again. So a win-win. Now, the carbon tax revenue has declined, but as you can see from this chart here, it is still pretty substantial and close to the top because as the economy grows and everything else, they end up emitting more carbon and it's just kind of more efficiently done. So the net effect on it isn't really that bad. But what it really comes down to with the carbon tax is it happens to be the most efficient way to reduce carbon emissions, which again also have a direct public health benefit to local populations. Here's Professor Reagan again.
And the reason why economists overwhelmingly support carbon pricing is because it is seen as, and there's a lot of evidence and logic that supports this, that carbon pricing is the lowest cost way to reduce emissions. It's not just a randomly chosen way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It's the lowest cost way.
And I love that, because essentially what he's saying is that a bunch of people ran the numbers on this and they looked at regulations and other ways to reduce carbon emissions. And it turns out the most cost-effective way is with the carbon tax. And it's good because you still have that freedom there. It's just an economic incentive or disincentive in this case. And that is, I think, is a more kind of open market way that is just seemingly more palatable to us here in the US. And it does beg the question, though, what would it look like in the US and could it actually work? The short answer to that is no, at least not right now. While the Trump administration is actively working to roll back climate protections, such as their recent order to repeal a tax on methane emissions above a certain level. Now, this tax would have been an incentive for companies to reduce their methane emissions by imposing fees on excess emissions, so above a certain level. And it's important to note here that most of the companies right now that are emitting methane as a part of their process, they would be falling below that level, meaning there'd be no additional cost to them. It's just a certain percentage that were above that. So in that way, it was a way to sort of cap where methane emissions are at and bring it down slightly for those that were emitting above that amount. And this fee that was repealed on methane or excess methane was projected to have a really good environmental impact comparable to removing 8 million gasoline-powered cars from the road. So no, I mean, there's basically no chance that this would go through. If you're looking at this and saying that the administration is targeting sort of like behind the scenes, smaller fees like this, I can't imagine them actually doing one that would be at the federal level on citizens like you and me. It just wouldn't be palatable and people would be furious about it because we would see it as sort of a restriction on our freedom, or maybe that's just my opinion on it. But maybe you're watching this 10 years down the road and things have changed. Who knows what the future holds? But to wrap it up, regardless of the fact that we could tax these emissions and use it to reduce personal income taxes, corporate income taxes in a substantial way, I really don't think that it's tenable with the current administration in the US, especially not while they're also subsidizing the fossil fuel industry with billions of your taxpayer dollars. And if you're curious about that, you weren't aware of that, check out this video over here where I dive deep into the history of energy subsidies in the US because it's kind of shocking if you haven't seen those details yet. And if you want to help support data-driven journalism like this and see an extended interview I did there with Professor Reagan, click the join button down below to become a channel member. It works better on desktop if you have the chance. That's it for this one, guys. Let me know what you think in the comments, and members, I'll see you backstage in 5.